It's a great honor for AlphaGeo to join in this very innovative partnership with Henley and Partners to launch the first ever Global Investment Risk and Resilience Index. This index represents a very timely marriage of Henley and Partners' pioneering work in defining and redefining the meaning of citizenship with AlphaGeo's meticulous research into measuring resilience for all societies around the world. Today, I'd like to walk you through some of the results and findings of this index. And first, I'll say a word or two about our methodology. Our objective was to take a holistic view on the meaning of resilience to factor in not only the traditional macroeconomic drivers, but also socioeconomic, climate, and other variables that shape the overall profile, desirability, and attractiveness of nations around the world. And we're very pleased with the novel results that have emerged from this joint collaboration. The first challenge that we faced, of course, is indeed to define resilience in particular. Whereas risk is very well known and measured according to exposure and vulnerability that can affect the performance of investments. With resilience, whereas there's an academic view and a social view around being able to absorb shocks and bounce back, we wanted to actually measure a state's or a society's capacity to do that directly matched to the risks that countries face. And that was the original conception behind this risk and resilience index. So how did we go about calculating it? This involved a multi-step process in determining the features, in backtesting them, in correlating them to various measures of state performance, weighting them, and of course, collecting data for as many countries and territories as possible, filling in data gaps, doing an initial sampling and collection of the data, and eventually determining which key variables we were going to use, building the composites for the risk side of the ledger and the resilience side of the ledger to come up with what you might call an overall balance sheet approach to measuring national resilience. Of course, those of you from or in Switzerland or with exposure to Switzerland will be pleased to know that it ranked number one in this index. And there's a couple of things that really stand out for us when you look at the overall top 10. First of all, small states perform exceptionally well. And this is actually not surprising because our methodology does bring in key metrics like economic diversification and innovation and socioeconomic performance, things like low inequality and quality of social services and infrastructure. Small states do extremely well in these areas. They always find themselves with less margin for error than larger states may have. Furthermore, Europe, of course, is well represented in the top 10. Germany is actually the only large country in the top 10. Another finding relates to the bottom 10, of course. What are the common characteristics of countries that rank overall relatively low? Those would be places that have high risk, but also have insufficient resilience capacity. So political instability is one of the factors that's common, high regulatory risk as well, weak governance generally, and low levels of socioeconomic development. Of particular concern in our analysis, you'll see some very large countries that appear here with large populations, Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Pakistan. And so, heavily populous countries that exhibit such characteristics, perhaps are more concerning and require a very substantial amount of fiscal commitment, policy commitment to turning around in order to really shore up their resilience. The overall rankings break down in a way that we wanted to isolate risk and resilience characteristics to help to illustrate how important it is to complement these categories against each other. So, for example, with lowest risk countries around the world, indeed, Europe, again, quite low risk in addition to being high resilience. But a couple of new countries show up here as low risk that are in the case of Canada in particular, quite large. However, their government debt or other fiscal constraints are a bit worrying. So their ability to, again, turn around is somewhat constrained fiscally. So despite the fact that they're low risk, they're not as high resilience as some of the other countries. Now, if we measure only the highest degree of risk without factoring in resilience, you see, again, some commonality, but other newer countries that are also on the list. Places like Turkey, again, another country with a large population. Iran is also on this list. So the Middle East becomes more prominent. Now, one of the reasons for that is not only the political instability that we're well aware of and the regulatory uncertainty in those countries, but also climate comes in as a significant factor here. So the lack of adaptation capacity to elevated climate risk is an amplifying factor, and therefore the number of countries around the world, including, of course, South Asia, Middle East, brings us beyond the traditional least developed markets of Africa when it comes to the overall risk score. Again, this underscores why it's so important to look holistically at risk, not only at resilience. Interestingly, now when we look at only the resilience factors, we get to isolate what helps societies bounce back from shocks without necessarily knowing what those shocks are going to be, whether they are geopolitical, whether they're economic, or climate. So here again, this to a strong degree mirrors the overall performance because European countries are both low risk and high resilience. But here again, we're highlighting the institutional strengths of the top performing countries, especially in Europe, the social stability, the economic complexity and diversification, and their investments in climate adaptation in particular. Now, even if a state is high risk, it could be high resilience, but if countries also lack that state capacity to adapt to risks, to boost their own resilience, they're going to show up on this particular list here. And again, the combination of poor economic fundamentals and weak governance are those that place countries really quite towards the bottom of the list. And here, this is dominated by mostly countries in Africa and a couple of countries from the Middle East and from the Caribbean. Let's spend a moment looking at European countries and what they have generally been doing right and how we've classified them in the overall typology and outcomes, because not only are there many European states, but generally they've scored extremely well. Now, of course, they're the traditional Western European and Nordic countries that have dominated the top tier of rankings. But given the strong performance of countries in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, we wanted to highlight here that Estonia, Czechia, and Slovenia, among others, emerge as what we call prime markets that are very strong performers. And let's get into a little bit of the logic of why. They have quite a favorable outlook in terms of that same combination of low risk and high resilience, and they perform quite well across more or less all of the indicators. They may simply be slightly weaker in terms of per capita income or other factors, but they are very high-performing states. Now, finally, there are the EU member states that are slightly higher risk. So the example of Hungary, which has faced a higher inflation and a slightly weaker legal and regulatory environment. Greece is a interesting case study for us because it has a generally weak score due to its fiscal position and high debt. However, we're seeing signs of a turnaround there as well. So again, overall, looking at the landscape, the broad landscape of European countries, there's a lot of potential in some of the newer markets to actually enhance their resilience scores and put themselves even more on the map as desirable and attractive destinations for investment. It's also worth turning briefly to Southeast Asia because, as you saw from the top 10 ranking, Singapore is in the top 5. And beyond Singapore, countries like Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia have quite favorable positions overall. They combine, again, quite low risk and sufficient resilience, though there's room for improvement. Macroeconomically, it is important to appreciate the extent to which Asian countries in general, and now even the so-called emerging markets of Southeast Asia, have been able to enhance their fiscal credibility and resilience by enhanced by having a greater degree of local currency borrowing and local currency debt, which has allowed them more fiscal room to maneuver. And they have been investing more and more in economic diversification and in managing their climate risk as well. Now let's look at an interesting category, which is countries that are high risk, but also have high resilience. And therefore, irrespective of the initial conditions, whether they be geographical or geopolitical, they nonetheless stand out as high potential places that are trying to make the most of their situations. So, a couple of brief examples that really jumped out at us were Vietnam and Kyrgyzstan, because they are places with quite solid, continuous year-on-year economic growth. They are making some degree of political reforms. They are managing their climate profile well also. So a number of states here, I would also flag Thailand and Kazakhstan as places that are, again, investing heavily both domestically and in terms of attracting foreign investment into strengthening their economic profile. And they are places that are certainly attracting migrants as well. I mentioned economic growth. We decided to also extract here countries that have very strong continuous, at least 5 years of continuous growth at greater than 4%. And so you see, again, a number of new countries popping up that we haven't discussed yet. Not only a couple of countries in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, even countries in East Africa like Tanzania, Vietnam, we mentioned earlier. And so if investors are looking for a strong growth profile for investments in corporate assets, private equity, other areas, these may be interesting places to look as well. And then naturally, one is looking for places that have Henley sponsored or other residence by investment or citizenship by investment programs. Of course, it's a very positive sign that most countries that have Henley programs do rank in the top categories: prime market, favorable outlook. That obviously is a very strong reflection on the benefits that Henley partnerships have brought to these countries, and their commitment to investment migration, which is a key factor in generating long-term value. And of course, these are also countries that see the incentive in protecting the value of those investments. I'll make a couple of quick comments on large economies, which again, of course, don't really feature in the top 10, but of course are too significant as players in the international system to ignore, and that one has exposure to, even if it's not residency exposure, through, of course, your international investment profile. The United States, of course, is in a period of elevated political volatility for sure. One might say potentially bordering on instability, but ultimately the risks are being managed. We still see, sort of the macroeconomic management finding a way through the current challenges that the country is facing. And the resilience score generally remains high in light of the US's very, very strong economy and growth profile. China actually doesn't rank that far behind the United States. And there are, of course, issues on regulatory opacity that the country faces, but its very strong state capacity is visible, obviously, in the economy, in the infrastructure, and its investments in innovation, which really do make China a highly, highly adaptive state that is rising in the rankings. Russia rather, is weighed down by high overall risk, given the political factors that go into some of the measurement. But note, as one might guess from its latitude, similar to Canada, is a place that has a high degree of natural resilience. And of course, Russia, one would assess as one of the countries that could, depending on the political outlook or priorities, enhance its resilience further. Again, much more spending would have to go into some of the socioeconomic criteria around resilience, and the political predictability or progress around institutional reforms would have to be seen as well. Lastly, we'll turn to India, which is, of course, the most populous country in the world and does rank quite low. It's on the risk watch list category. It has both high risks, but also quite low adaptation, especially to its physical climate profile. This is something that is worrying. Our own research has shown that while many investors and analysts and international institutions expect India's GDP to reach $8 to $8.5 trillion by 2030, we believe that the climate risk in India is going to cost the economy at least $500 billion in the next several years. So it's an example of how even a great power economy is not going to score high in resilience unless it genuinely makes those investments. So it may seem from an orthodox economic standpoint to be a fairly heretical commentary, but such is the importance and the disruption that climate represents, that if a country is not investing massively in adaptation, it will be penalized, you might say. Looking at the top performing countries in Africa, there are a fair number that score relatively well in a sort of moderate risk rating. We have found that Mauritius, Tanzania, which I mentioned earlier, and Botswana have relatively low risk and moderate resilience. Again, structural reforms, resilience investments from a fiscal standpoint are going to make a big difference. And they do, given the performance of African markets and the relatively attractive valuation profiles that they represent, it is a sensible destination for investors also. I'll conclude with just a reminder as to, not only why we've done this, because measuring resilience is so important and it expands the metrics that investors, that migrants are going to use to determine where they invest, but it's also to inspire, to motivate. Henley's own indices over the years have contributed a great deal to countries undertaking reforms to make themselves more attractive. The layer that we're adding with this index is not merely to rank, not merely to offer scores, but rather, again, in that same spirit, to encourage adaptation. And we at AlphaGeo are motivated by this quote that many people, of course, know from Charles Darwin, that it is not the strongest of the species that survives or the most intelligent, but the most adaptable to change. And in times of volatility, it is adaptability that is going to be a key factor in determining which countries survive and which countries score the highest in terms of resilience. And to come full circle, it is very much geographical resilience that we aspire to measure, not only at the country level, as we've done with this index, but very much at the coordinate level for those investors who have real estate portfolios or looking to make concrete investments in land and real estate anywhere in the world. We try to measure with precision the resilience of those locations, of those assets, and provide the kinds of metrics to ensure that your overall portfolio is more resilient. So I want to extend my gratitude again to Henley for this incredible partnership, for the joint research that has resulted in this novel Global Investment Risk and Resilience Index, which we very much hope is of great value to you, to your as investors, and to your communities and to your nations. Thank you very much.